The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours and every controller in the tower at Bagram Airfield went silent. It wasn't the static that stopped them. It wasn't even the call sign that followed, though that name carried weight most rookies would never understand. It was the four words that came after, spoken in a voice so calm it felt like ice water down every spine in that room. Gears gone, coming in hot. The A-10 Thunderbolt II materialized from the northeast like a ghost refusing to stay buried, low enough that maintenance crews on the tarmac could see the hydraulic fluid streaming from her belly like black rain. Tower Chief Marcus Hendricks had 23 years behind that glass, had talked down birds on fire, pilots bleeding out, engines eating themselves alive. He'd never once told a pilot there was no way back, until tonight. Raven 7-3, negative on approach. Repeat, negative. Divert to Kandahar. You are not landing here. The reply came without hesitation, without anger, without anything except the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who's already made peace with whatever comes next. Tower, Raven 7-3, Kandahar's 40 minutes. I've got maybe 12 before hydraulics are gone completely. I'm not ejecting over the Hindu Kush in the dark, and I'm not putting this bird down in a village. So clear the runway or don't. Either way, I'm landing. Hendricks looked at his senior controller, a captain named Oakes who'd gone pale. Every pilot knew the math. An A-10 without landing gear wasn't just dangerous. It was a 30-ton sled with engines, carrying enough depleted uranium rounds in the nose to punch through a tank and fuel tanks that would turn the whole airframe into a fireball the second it touched concrete. The pilot would be lucky to walk away. Everyone else on the ground would be lucky if she managed to keep it straight. Who is that? Oakes whispered. Hendricks didn't answer right away. He was watching the Warthog drop lower, watching the way she handled, nose slightly high, compensating for the drag without overcorrecting. Whoever was flying that plane knew her like a second skin. Captain Lyra Cassis, Hendricks said finally. Call sign Raven. Did 11 months over Helmand in 2012. They tried to ground her after Sangin. Oakes blinked. Sangin, that was her. Hendricks nodded slowly, eyes still locked on the descending aircraft. The story had become legend in certain circles, the kind of mission they didn't put in official reports because it made everyone else look too human by comparison. Yeah, that was her. Outside, the A-10 silhouette cut across the perimeter lights, belly exposed, gear doors hanging open like broken teeth, and still she flew like she owned the sky. Hendricks reached for the radio. His hand was steady, but his voice carried something that hadn't been there before. Respect. All stations, this is Tower. Clear runway 27. Emergency landing in progress. Crash crews to positions. This is not a drill. The Warthog came in at Angels 2, descending through the thin mountain air with a sound like controlled fury. Lyra Cassis sat in the cockpit surrounded by warning lights that had stopped meaning anything 10 minutes ago. Red, amber, flashing white. The instrument screamed at her in a language she'd learned to ignore when it tried to tell her things she already knew. Hydraulic pressure was gone. Flight control systems were running on backup. The landing gear had torn away somewhere over the Spingar range when she'd pushed the aircraft through evasive maneuvers that should have ripped the wings clean off. Should have. Didn't. That was the thing about the A-10 that the newer pilots never understood, the ones who wanted sleek and fast and pretty. The Warthog wasn't built to be beautiful. She was built to take a beating and keep flying, built around a gun so massive they had to design the plane second, built to absorb punishment that would turn an F-16 into confetti. Lyra had put that theory to the test tonight in ways Fairchild Republic never imagined. The mission brief had been straightforward. Close air support for a special forces team pinned down in a valley 40 clicks west of the Pakistani border. Taliban fighters had them surrounded, dug into positions that artillery couldn't touch without risking the Americans caught in the middle. Standard Raven work. Get low. Get dirty. Make the enemy remember why they feared the sound of turbofans. She'd made her first gun run at 200 feet, the GAU-8 Avenger cannon sending 70 rounds per second into fortified positions with accuracy that turned concealment into kindling. The tracers lit up the night like falling stars, every fifth round burning bright so she could walk the fire exactly where it needed to go. The Special Forces ground commander's voice had crackled through her headset, professional relief wrapped in exhausted gratitude. Raven 7-3, direct hit. Say again, direct hit. You just saved our lives. Lyra had pulled up, gained altitude, circled back for assessment. That's when the mountain had tried to kill her. Not the enemy, the terrain itself. A downdraft off the ridge had caught her in the climb, slamming the A-10 sideways into a physics problem with only one solution. She'd rolled inverted, pushed the throttles to maximum, and dove straight down into the valley instead of fighting the air. Let gravity be the ally instead of the enemy. The maneuver had worked. The landing gear hadn't survived it. She'd felt the vibration through the stick when the struts tore free, felt the aircraft's handling change in ways that told the whole story without needing to look. 3,000 pounds of steel and hydraulics just gone, tumbling down into the darkness below. The ground team had called it in immediately. Raven 7-3, we see debris falling from your aircraft. What's your status? Lyra had checked her instruments, run through the emergency procedures in her head with the speed that only comes from having done this dance before, and made the call. Ground team, Raven 7-3, gears compromised. RTB Bagram, you're clear. Raven, you need support. We can vector tanker, negative, save your assets. Raven out. Now Bagram's runway lights stretched ahead like a promise she wasn't sure the universe intended to keep. The crash crews positioned themselves along the runway with the kind of controlled urgency that separates professionals from everyone else who just wears the uniform. Fire Chief Danny Ortega had seen his share of bad landings, but this was different. This was physics versus will, and he wasn't sure which side the universe was betting on. The A-10 lined up on final approach, and even from the ground he could see the problem. No gear meant no shock absorption, no way to bleed off speed gradually, no margin for error. Just 30 tons of aircraft meeting concrete at 140 knots with nothing between them except whatever tricks the pilot had left. Inside the cockpit, Lyra ran through the checklist one final time, not because she needed to, but because ritual mattered when chaos was seconds away. Flaps deployed manually. Speed precisely calculated. Angle of descent adjusted for the belly landing she'd practiced in simulators, but never imagined she'd actually need. The A-10's titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit would protect her from ground fire that could shred lesser aircraft. Whether it would save her from her own landing was a different question. She thought about ejecting. The Martin Baker seat would punch her clear, send her drifting down under canopy while the Warthog plowed into the runway and disintegrated in a fireball that would light up the entire airfield. Safe, simple, by the book. She could already hear the investigation board's conclusions. Pilot followed emergency procedures. Aircraft lost but pilot recovered. No fault assigned, except she'd spent 11 months over Helmand learning that some things mattered more than by-the-book safety. The ground teams who'd called her in when everything else had failed. The Afghan civilians she'd kept alive by putting her aircraft between them and the Taliban. The other pilots who'd seen her work and started to believe that maybe competence mattered more than the assumptions people made in the ready room. She keyed the radio one more time. Tower, Raven 7-3, final approach, belly landing, clear all personnel from impact zone. Hendrick's voice came back immediately. Raven 7-3, Tower. Runway is yours. We've got you. The ground rushed up. Lyra pulled the nose high, killed the throttles at precisely the right moment, and let the A-10 do what it was born to do. Survive. The first impact sounded like the world ending. Titanium scraped concrete with a shriek that echoed across the entire airfield, throwing sparks in a rooster tail 50 feet high. The aircraft slewed slightly left and Lyra corrected with rudder, keeping the nose straight through pure muscle memory and instinct. The engines screamed in protest, turbofans ingesting their own debris, but they kept running. That was the Warthog's secret. Everything about her was redundant, overbuilt, designed to keep fighting even when physics said to quit. The A-10 skidded down the runway, shedding parts and speed in equal measure, metal screaming, fire crews racing alongside. And through it all, Lyra kept her hand steady on controls that barely responded, willing the aircraft to hold together for just 30 more seconds. 2010. The Warthog came to rest 4,000 feet down the runway, nose slightly askew, engine still whining, and Lyra Cassis sat in the cockpit running post-landing checks like it was just another Tuesday. Fire Chief Ortega reached the aircraft before the sparks stopped falling, foam crews already drowning the hot spots in white suppressant that turned the whole scene into something from another world. He climbed up the access ladder, expecting to find a pilot in shock, shaking, maybe injured. What he found instead was Captain Lyra Cassis methodically shutting down systems, her hands moving across switches with the precision of a concert pianist finishing a performance. She looked up when his face appeared in the canopy, and Ortega saw something in her eyes he'd only seen a handful of times in 20 years. Not relief, not fear, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd solved a problem everyone else said was unsolvable. "You good, Captain?" Ortega shouted through the glass. Lyra nodded, popped the canopy release. The night air hit her face, cool and clean, carrying the smell of foam and jet fuel and survival. "I'm good, Chief. Bird might need some work, though." Ortega barked out a laugh despite himself. It looked like it had gone 10 rounds with a mountain and one on points. The entire belly was scraped raw, engines were toast, hydraulic systems were scattered across 3 provinces, and the landing gear situation spoke for itself. Some work. Yeah, that's one way to put it. Lyra unstrapped, climbed down the ladder with Ortega steadying her at the bottom. Her legs were solid, no tremor, no hesitation. She turned to look at her aircraft, and something in her expression made Ortega step back slightly. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was more like respect between 2 fighters who'd just been through hell together. Tower Chief Hendricks arrived in a Humvee with Captain Oakes, both of them climbing out while the crash crews finished their work. Hendricks approached Lyra with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for handling unexploded ordnance. "Captain Cassis, hell of a landing." Lyra turned to face him, and Hendricks got his first good look at the pilot who'd just done the impossible. She was compact, built like a wrestler, dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had somehow survived the whole ordeal. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat, and there was a cut above her left eyebrow she probably didn't even know about yet. But it was her eyes that caught him, calm, focused, absolutely certain. "Tower Chief, thanks for clearing the runway." Hendricks shook his head slowly. "You gave me orders, Captain, I just followed them. That's not how the chain of command works. Tonight it was." Oakes stepped forward, extending a hand. "Captain Oakes, sir, that was. I've never seen anything like that." Lyra shook his hand, nodding the formality, the uncertainty in how to address her. She'd dealt with it her entire career. The assumptions, the second-guessing, the quiet surprise when competence didn't match expectations. "You will," she said simply. "A-10 drivers practice for this. Most of us just never need it." "Most of you don't fly like that," Hendricks said, and there was something in his voice that made Lyra look at him more carefully. "Sanguine, 2012, that was you." It wasn't a question. Lyra felt the weight of that name, that mission, settle across her shoulders like an old coat she'd tried to leave behind. "That was me." The story of Sanguine had become myth in certain circles. The kind of thing that gets whispered in ready rooms when the new pilots think they understand what close air support really means. Hendricks had only heard pieces, fragments passed along by ground controllers who'd worked that sector, by maintenance crews who'd seen the aircraft when it finally limped home. Now he was standing in front of the woman who'd flown it, and the impossible landing he'd just witnessed suddenly made a different kind of sense. "I'd like to hear it," Hendricks said. "The real version." Lyra looked at the wreckage of her A-10, then at the 2 men waiting for words she wasn't sure she wanted to give. But there was something in their faces that wasn't the usual curiosity. It was the look of people trying to understand how someone pushes past limits everyone else accepts as absolute. "Not much to tell," she said, but Hendricks just waited, and Lyra recognized the patience of someone who'd spent years talking pilots through emergencies. "You didn't rush that kind of patience. You respected it." September 2012. Marine platoon pinned in Sanguine District, surrounded on 3 sides, taking fire from a compound they couldn't reach. "I was flying support, solo bird, because the mission profile said 1 was enough for reconnaissance and potential engagement." She paused, remembering the way the valley had looked that day. The way the radio had sounded when the platoon sergeant's voice came through requesting immediate support with the kind of calm that only exists when there's no room left for panic. Intel said small arms fire, maybe a heavy machine gun. What they didn't say was that the Taliban had moved a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun into position the night before. Soviet-era, twin-barreled, designed specifically to kill aircraft like mine at low altitude. Inhaled sharply. The Zu-23 was a pilot's nightmare, capable of throwing up a wall of 23 rounds that could shred an aircraft before the pilot even saw the muzzle flash. Lyra continued, her voice steady. I made my first gun run standard approach, came in low to identify targets and provide suppressive fire while the Marines repositioned. That's when the Zu-23 opened up. They'd waited for me to commit, let me get low and slow where evasion options were limited. You got hit, Hendricks said. 7 times. Port engine took 3 rounds, lost 30% thrust immediately. Starboard wing took 4 rounds, 2 through the fuel tank, 2 through the flight control surfaces. The A-10's built to take punishment, but this was pushing it. I should have broken off, gained altitude, called for support. Standard procedure. But you didn't, Oak said quietly. Lyra met his eyes. There were 23 Marines down there. The Zu-23's position gave it clear line of sight to their fallback route. If I broke off, they'd be cut down in the open within minutes. So I rolled inverted, dove on the gun position from an angle they didn't expect and put a 2-second burst through their sandbags from 800 feet. While your aircraft was on fire, Hendricks added because he'd heard that part. While my aircraft was producing smoke, Lyra corrected. The port engine was damaged but contained. Fire suppressant did its job. I had thrust, I had control, I had ammunition. That's enough. How many runs? 6 more, methodical, every Taliban position that had line of sight to the Marines. Then I stayed on station for 40 minutes while they extracted, circling at altitude, systems failing one by one, nursing that port engine like it was made of glass. And then I flew back to base and landed the aircraft. Maintenance crews counted 347 holes when they were done. The A-10 flew again 2 weeks later. The silence that followed Lyra's words carried weight, the kind that settles when people realize they're standing in the presence of something that transcends normal metrics of courage or skill. Hendricks had spent 2 decades watching pilots land, but he'd never quite understood what separated the good ones from the legends. Now he thought maybe he did. It wasn't about reflexes or training or even bravery in the traditional sense. It was about the capacity to look at an impossible situation and simply refuse to accept impossibility as an answer. The Marines, Oak said. They all made it out, Lyra nodded. All 23, 3 wounded, none critical. They wrote me up for a Silver Star. I told them to give it to the corpsman who kept those 3 alive during the extraction. Did they? No, I got the medal. The corpsman got a Navy Achievement Medal and went back to his unit. That's how these things work. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned that recognition and justice didn't always overlap. Hendricks glanced at the A-10 behind her, then back at Lyra's face. And after Sangin, what happened? What always happens: medical review, psychological evaluation, extended desk duty while they determined whether I was a hero or a liability. 6 months of watching other pilots fly missions while I pushed papers and attended briefings where people who'd never been shot had explained why I should have done things differently. They tried to ground you permanently, Hendricks said, putting pieces together. They tried. Said I had taken unnecessary risks, exhibited poor judgment under fire, failed to follow established protocols for damaged aircraft. They weren't wrong about the protocols. I broke about 14 different regulations that day. And the Marines you saved? Oakes asked. What did they say? Lyra's expression softened slightly, the first real emotion breaking through the professional control. They showed up to every hearing, all 23 of them, took leave, traveled cross-country, sat in uncomfortable chairs in Pentagon conference rooms, and told anyone who would listen that I was the reason they got to go home to their families. The platoon sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Chen, he testified that I'd given them covering fire so precise they could advance by the sound of my gun runs alone. She paused, remembering the weight of that testimony, The Wei Chen's voice had carried absolute conviction that cut through all the bureaucratic uncertainty. In the end, they couldn't ground a pilot the Marines were calling a guardian angel, so they compromised. Certified me for continued flight status but flagged my file with recommendations for appropriate mission assignment and oversight. Which means, Oakes asked. Which means I've spent the last 3 years flying missions just like tonight. The hard ones. The ones where someone needs to get low, stay calm, and make things work when the easy answers ran out. They don't say it officially, but everyone knows. When a ground team needs support and the situation's complicated, they call Raven. Hendricks understood. The military had a way of taking people who didn't fit the standard mold and finding places where their particular talents became indispensable. Lyra Cassis was too valuable to ground, but too unconventional to fully embrace, so they'd made her into a specialist in the kind of missions that required exactly the qualities they'd once questioned. The arrival of Colonel Sarah Vance interrupted the moment, the base commander approaching with the stride of someone who'd been awakened at 400 hours and wasn't entirely happy about it. She took in the scene, the crashed A-10, the pilot standing calm while fire crews finished their work, and her expression shifted through several calculations at once. Captain Cassis, report. Colonel Vance had commanded Bagram for 18 months, long enough to know most of her pilots by name and reputation, short enough that Lyra Cassis remained something of an enigma. The captain flew out of her squadron but operated under tasking orders that came from theater command, missions that weren't discussed in morning briefings, ground teams that existed in after-action reports but not on official manning documents. The Ghost Squadron, some pilots called it, though never officially. The ones who flew where policy met reality and found the gap uncomfortable. Lyra straightened slightly but didn't salute. On the flight line, during active operations, salutes drew sniper attention and marked officers for targeting. Vance appreciated the tactical awareness. Ma'am, Raven 7-3 completed close air support mission at grid November Kilo 4728. Special Forces team extraction under fire. During evasive maneuvers at low altitude, aircraft experienced catastrophic landing gear failure. Diverted to Bagram and executed emergency belly landing. Aircraft is damaged but pilot and all ground personnel are unharmed. Vance looked at the A-10, really looked at it, taking in the scars and the burns and the titanium belly worn smooth from contact with concrete at speeds that should have torn the plane apart. Evasive maneuvers, that's what we're calling it. Yes, ma'am. The terrain was uncooperative. Despite herself, Vance felt the corner of her mouth twitch. The terrain was uncooperative. That was like saying the ocean was slightly damp. The ground team you were supporting, they make it out. All personnel extracted successfully. No casualties. Mission complete. And you decided that landing here without gear was preferable to ejecting. It was the question that mattered, the one that would determine whether this went into the books as heroic airmanship or reckless disregard for safety protocols. Lyra met Vance's eyes without hesitation. Ma'am, ejection over the Hindu Kush at night would have resulted in probable injury during landing in mountainous terrain, lengthy rescue operation requiring additional assets and personnel at risk, and complete loss of the aircraft. Belly landing allowed me to maintain control of the aircraft's impact point, minimize risk to ground personnel, and preserve the aircraft for salvage and investigation. I made the tactical choice that resulted in the best outcome for all assets involved. Vance heard the unspoken part clearly. I made the choice. Not we. Not the situation dictated. That was the thing about Cassis that made commanders uncomfortable. She didn't hide behind circumstances or share responsibility with the universe. She owned her decisions completely, which meant she also owned all the consequences, good or bad. It was admirable and terrifying in equal measure. The A-10's a tough bird, Vance said, looking at the aircraft again. But she's not invincible. No, ma'am, but she's close. Hendricks cleared his throat, and Vance glanced at him with the expression that said he had about 10 seconds to make whatever point he was building toward. Colonel, for what it's worth, I've been in this tower for 23 years. I've talked down birds in worse shape, but I've never seen anyone fly like Captain Cassis just did. That wasn't luck. That was skill. Vance absorbed this, weighing it against regulations and protocols, and the thousand small ways that the military tried to fit people into boxes that didn't quite account for exceptional circumstances. Captain, you're grounded pending investigation and medical clearance. That's not punishment, that's procedure. You just belly landed a combat aircraft. I need doctors to confirm you're uninjured and investigators to document what happened. Understood, ma'am. But off the record. Vance lowered her voice slightly and the formality dropped just enough to let something human through. That was a hell of a piece of flying. Your gear failed, your hydraulics were gone, and you still put that warthog down like you'd practiced it 100 times. Whatever else comes out of this investigation, you saved the aircraft, you saved yourself, and you completed your mission. That matters. Lyra nodded, accepting the words without false modesty or deflection. Medical cleared Lyra in 40 minutes, finding nothing more serious than bruised ribs, the cut above her eyebrow that required 3 stitches, and blood pressure that the flight surgeon said was unreasonably calm for someone who just crashed a plane. She spent the rest of the night in debriefings, walking investigators through every decision from the moment the landing gear failed to the moment the A-10 stopped sliding down the runway. She answered every question with the same precise clarity, never embellishing, never deflecting, just stating facts in chronological order like she was reading from a checklist. By 800 hours, she was released to her quarters, told to get some sleep, and informed that a formal investigation board would convene within 72 hours. She made it halfway across the base before the first pilot intercepted her. Captain James Ridley, F-16 driver, 2 combat tour and the kind of swagger that came from flying aircraft that could break the sound barrier. He fell into step beside Lyra without invitation, and she recognized the type immediately. The ones who needed to prove something, needed to be seen acknowledging what had happened, needed to file themselves into the story somehow. Cassis, heard about your landing, that was pretty wild. Lyra kept walking. Just flying the aircraft, Ridley. Come on. No landing gear, middle of the night, you brought her down like a pro. That's not just flying, that's artistry. It's called following emergency procedures and not panicking. Ridley laughed, the sound carrying an edge that made Lyra's jaw tighten. Emergency procedures, right. That what they taught you at flight school, how to crash gracefully. Lyra stopped walking. Ridley overshot by 2 steps before he realized she wasn't beside him anymore, and when he turned back, something in her expression made his smile falter. Ridley, you have something you want to say, or are you just filling space with noise? Hey, I'm just saying it's impressive. Girl pilot brings down a warthog on its belly, that's the kind of thing that makes the highlight reel. Girl pilot. There it was. The thing that had followed Lyra through every squadron, every deployment, every mission. The qualifier that turned competence into surprise, that made her successes remarkable instead of expected, that suggested her presence in the cockpit was something novel rather than earned. Here's what's impressive, Ridley. I completed my mission. Brought my aircraft home, walked away without injuries. That's the job, that's what we all signed up to do. Gender doesn't enter into it. I didn't mean, yes you did. You meant exactly what you said, girl pilot, like it's surprising. Like I'm operating with some kind of handicap that makes basic airmanship noteworthy. Ridley's expression shifted, defensive. That's not fair. I was giving you a compliment. I don't need compliments for doing my job. I need pilots who treat competence as the baseline expectation regardless of who's in the cockpit. Can you do that? The silence stretched between them, and Lyra saw the moment Ridley decided this conversation wasn't worth whatever point he'd been trying to make. He muttered something about meaning well and walked away, leaving Lyra standing alone in the morning sun. She closed her eyes, took a long breath, and felt the weight of 1,000 similar conversations settle across her shoulders. This was the part they didn't show in the recruiting videos. Not the flying, not the combat. The constant low-grade effort of proving that you belonged in a space where half the people you met started from the assumption that your presence required explanation. She thought about Sangan, about the Marines who'd shown up to those hearings, about Gunnery Sergeant Chen's testimony. He told the board something she'd never forgotten. Captain Cassis didn't save us because she's a woman or despite being a woman. She saved us because she's a damn good pilot who refused to abandon her Marines. That's the only qualification that matters. The investigation board convened in a conference room that smelled like coffee and old briefing papers. 3 senior officers behind a table with Lyra sitting across from them in her dress uniform, ribbons and wings catching the fluorescent light. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb ran the proceedings, a career aviator who'd flown F-15s during Desert Storm and now spent his days trying to determine whether younger pilots were heroes or liabilities. He'd read Lyra's file 3 times before the hearing, and what he'd found there painted a picture that didn't quite fit standard categories. Exceptional pilot, questionable judgment, multiple commendations, multiple investigations. A woman who seemed to operate in the space between regulations and results, making command uncomfortable while making ground teams grateful. Captain Cassis, Webb began, walk us through your decision-making process when the landing gear failed. Lyra had prepared for this, knew that the investigation wasn't really about whether she'd followed procedures. It was about whether her deviation from those procedures represented sound tactical judgment or dangerous improvisation. Sir, when I felt the gear separate, I immediately assessed my options. Ejection would have put me in hostile territory at night with lengthy rescue requirements. Diversion to Kandahar risked complete hydraulic failure en route. Landing at Bagram allowed me to control variables and minimize overall risk. Major Catherine Park, the second board member, leaned forward. Minimize risk to whom, Captain? The aircraft was carrying live ammunition, full fuel load. A belly landing could have resulted in catastrophic fire, explosion, casualties among ground personnel. Yes, ma'am. That's why I calculated the approach to maximize my control window, coordinated with Tower to clear all non-essential personnel, and executed the landing with specific attention to keeping the aircraft's centerline. The risk existed, but it was manageable with proper execution. And if your execution hadn't been proper, Park pressed. Lyra held her gaze. Then I would have died, and the investigation would be reviewing my mistakes instead of my decisions. But I was confident in my ability to execute. Confident, Park repeated. Based on what? Had you practiced belly landings in an A-10? No, ma'am, but I'd practiced every other emergency procedure until it was instinctive. I understood the aircraft's handling characteristics, knew my own capabilities, and made the tactical choice that offered the best probability of mission success. The third board member, Colonel Raymond Santos, had been silent until now. He was older than Webb, gray at the temples, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of asking hard questions. Captain, let's talk about Sangin. Your file shows that incident resulted in significant controversy regarding your decision-making under pressure. Do you see parallels between that situation and this one? Lyra had known this question was coming, but still felt the weight of it. Sangin was the lens through which every subsequent decision would be viewed, the mission that had defined her career and haunted her file. Sir, both situations required me to assess risk versus outcome in compressed timeframes. In both cases, following standard procedures would have resulted in what I judged to be worse outcomes. The difference is that in Sangin, I had Marines depending on me for survival. Last night, I only had myself and my aircraft. Only yourself, Santos repeated. And you determined that your survival was worth risking everyone on this base. No, sir. I determined that my controlled belly landing presented less risk than ejection and uncontrolled aircraft impact. I made the call that saved the most lives and preserved the most assets. That's what we're trained to do. Santos studied her for a long moment. You don't sound uncertain, Captain. Most pilots I've sat across from after incidents like this show at least some doubt, some acknowledgement that maybe they got lucky. I don't believe in luck, sir. I believe in preparation meeting opportunity. I prepared for emergencies my entire career. Last night was the opportunity to prove that preparation mattered. Webb exchanged glances with Park and Santos, and Lyra saw something pass between them, some unspoken communication. The board deliberated for 6 hours, reviewing flight data, maintenance records, radio transcripts, and witness statements from everyone who'd seen the landing. They interviewed Tower Chief Hendricks, Fire Chief Ordega, Colonel Vance. They analyzed the damage to the A-10 with engineers who explained in technical detail exactly how close the aircraft had come to catastrophic failure. And through it all, they kept coming back to the same question. Was Lyra Cassis an exceptional pilot who made hard calls correctly, or a reckless maverick who'd gotten lucky twice and would eventually run out of miracles? The answer came at 1900 hours when Webb called Lyra back into the conference room. She entered alone, standing at attention while the three officers looked at papers they'd probably memorized hours ago. "Captain Cassis," Webb said, and his voice carried a formality that could mean anything. "This board has reviewed all available evidence regarding the incident on November 29th. We've examined your flight history, your training records, and the specific circumstances that led to your emergency landing. We've also reviewed the Sanguine incident and its bearing on your current judgment." Lyra kept her expression neutral, waiting. "Our findings are as follows. First, the landing gear failure was mechanical, not pilot error. Maintenance records show no prior indication of structural weakness, and the stresses you placed on the aircraft during evasive maneuvers, while extreme, were within acceptable parameters for combat operations. Second, your decision to land at Bagram rather than eject or divert was tactically sound given the specific circumstances. While it deviated from standard procedure, the outcome supports your assessment. Third, your execution of the emergency landing demonstrated exceptional airmanship and resulted in minimal damage to base infrastructure and zero casualties." Lyra felt something uncoil in her chest but kept her face neutral. "However," Webb continued, and Lyra braced for the other shoe, "this board has concerns about a pattern of behavior that, while effective, consistently places you at the outer edges of acceptable risk tolerance. Both Sanguine and this incident show a pilot who makes decisions that work but leave little margin for error. That concerns us." "Understood, sir." "That said," Santos interjected, and Lyra looked at him, "there's a difference between recklessness and calculated risk. We've spent considerable time debating which category your actions fall into. The conclusion we've reached is that you operate in a space that most pilots can't access because you possess both the skill to execute high-risk maneuvers and the judgment to know when those risks are justified." Park added, "You're cleared for flight status, Captain. No restrictions. But understand that this board is documenting a pattern. A third incident of this nature will be viewed very differently. The military can tolerate calculated risk-taking. It cannot tolerate a pilot who believes normal rules don't apply." "I don't believe that, ma'am," Lyra said quietly. "I believe the rules exist to produce the best outcomes, and sometimes the best outcome requires understanding when the rules themselves become the obstacle." Webb actually smiled at that, a small expression that transformed his face. "That's exactly what we're talking about, Captain. That attitude is what makes you valuable and what makes command nervous. We're going to document this incident as justified emergency action with commendation for airmanship under extreme circumstances. You'll receive a formal recognition for your actions. You'll also receive a formal counseling memo reminding you that heroics have costs." "Yes, sir. Understood. Dismissed, Captain." Lyra saluted, executed a perfect about-face, and walked out of that conference room feeling like she'd been simultaneously vindicated and put on notice. The corridor outside was empty, but she could feel eyes watching from offices and ready rooms, pilots and ground crew who'd heard about the hearing and wanted to know whether Raven was still flying or getting grounded. She kept her face neutral until she reached the bathroom, locked herself in a stall, and finally let the tension drain from her shoulders. She'd survived again. The pattern continued. Word spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip can achieve, moving through ready rooms and mess halls and maintenance hangars in a chain of whispers and assumptions. By midnight, everyone at Bagram knew that Captain Lyra Cassis had been cleared, commended, and counseled all at once. The reactions varied. Some pilots, the ones who'd flown combat and understood the difference between procedure and survival, nodded with quiet respect. Others, the newer ones still convinced that following the manual was the only path to success, wondered aloud whether Cassis was getting special treatment. And a few, the ones who'd been watching her career from the beginning, recognized something else entirely. They were watching the military's complicated relationship with exceptionalism play out in real time, the way institutions that demanded conformity struggled to handle people who produced results through methods that didn't fit the template. In the maintenance hangar, Tech Sergeant Maria Delgado stood beneath the wounded A-10 with her team, assessing damage that should have been catastrophic. The titanium bathtub was scarred but intact. The engines were destroyed but had failed gracefully, shutting down without explosions. The fuel tanks had ruptured but not ignited. Every system had broken in exactly the right way to keep the pilot alive. She flew this home. One of the younger mechanics asked, a kid fresh from tech school who still thought aircraft were predictable machines. Delgado ran her hand along the scraped belly, feeling the heat-scored metal. She didn't just fly it home. She landed it like she cared about what happened after she walked away. Look at this. She pointed to the impact pattern, the way the aircraft had touched down perfectly centerline, the way the weight distribution had been controlled to prevent a cartwheel or breakup. This is what it looks like when a pilot knows their aircraft better than the engineers who built it. Can we fix her? We can rebuild her. Won't be quick, won't be cheap, but yeah, this bird's got more life left. They both do. Delgado had worked on Cassis's aircraft before, back after Sangin, when everyone thought the A-10 was headed for the scrapyard. She'd spent 3 weeks cataloging damage, finding holes in places that should have been fatal, discovering systems that had kept working through punishment that should have shut them down instantly. She developed a grudging respect for both the aircraft and the pilot who understood how to push its limits without breaking what mattered. Across the base, in the officers' quarters, Lyra sat on her bunk writing the after-action report that would go into official files, documenting everything in the precise, unemotional language that military bureaucracy demanded. The words felt inadequate somehow, reducing hours of flight and fear and decision-making into bullet points and timestamps. But that was how the institution processed experience, turning the messy reality of combat into data that could be filed and analyzed and referenced in future training. She thought about the Special Forces team she'd supported, wondered if they'd made it home yet, if they knew their extraction had cost her an aircraft. Probably not. That was how these things worked. Ground teams called for support, support arrived, everyone went home alive, and the connections between cause and effect got lost in the operational chaos. She'd never meet those soldiers, never hear them tell their version of the story, never know what they'd been thinking when her gun runs had given them the breathing room to survive. That was fine. She hadn't done it for recognition. She'd done it because that was the job. The knock on her door came at 100 hours, quiet but insistent. Lyra answered to find Colonel Vance standing in the corridor in PT gear, looking like she'd just finished a run. "Captain, walk with me." They walked in silence through the base, past darkened hangars and quiet flight lines, until Vance led them to a bench overlooking the runway where the A-10 had made its landing hours before. The concrete still showed scorch marks, black streaks that maintenance would pressure wash away by morning, but that tonight served as evidence of survival. Vance sat down without preamble, and Lyra joined her, both of them staring at the runway like it held answers to questions they hadn't figured out how to ask. "You know what bothers me about your file," Vance said finally. "Not the incidents, not the commendations or the investigations. What bothers me is that you're the best tactical pilot I have, and I can't fully utilize you because half my command structure is waiting for you to fail." Lyra absorbed this, the unusual candor from a commanding officer. "Ma'am, let me finish. You scare people, Cassis, not because you're reckless. Because you make decisions that look reckless until they work, and then everyone has to recalibrate what they thought was possible. That's threatening to an institution built on predictability and standardization. But it's also exactly what we need when situations stop being standard." Vance turned to look at her directly. "Sangin should have ended your career. By every normal metric, you violated protocols, took unnecessary risks, and got lucky. Except you didn't get lucky. You made a series of calculated decisions under fire that resulted in the best possible outcome. And when this command tried to punish you for it, the Marines you saved wouldn't let them. That's power, Cassis, the kind that makes generals uncomfortable. I'm not trying to make anyone uncomfortable, ma'am. I know. That's what makes it worse. You're not pushing boundaries for ego or rebellion. You're doing it because when you look at a situation, you see solutions that nobody else sees and you can't not execute them. That's gift and curse simultaneously. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of jet fuel and desert dust. Lyra waited for Vance to continue, recognizing that this conversation was going somewhere specific. I'm transferring you, Vance said. Not as punishment, as assignment to a unit that specializes in exactly what you do. They're based out of Qatar, operate under theater command, fly missions that don't make it into normal rotations. The kind of work where your particular talents are assets rather than liabilities. The Ghost Squadron, Lyra said quietly. That's not the official designation, but yes. They need pilots who can operate independently, make hard calls without waiting for approval up the chain, and execute missions where failure isn't an option because there's no backup plan. You've been doing that freelance for 3 years. I'm making it official. Lyra felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this was the inevitable conclusion to the pattern her career had been following. The military had a way of sorting people into roles that matched their capabilities, and she'd been pushing toward this assignment since Sangin, whether she'd admitted it or not. When? 2 weeks. Finish your medical clearance, complete the investigation paperwork, and then you're reassigned. Your new commanding officer is Colonel James Thorne, former combat controller, ran operations in places that don't exist on official maps. He'll understand what you bring to the table. And if I decline, Vance smiled, the expression carrying both humor and inevitability. You won't, because you know as well as I do that standard squadron operations are never going to fit you properly. You need missions that require your specific approach. This is it. Lyra looked back at the runway, at the marks her landing had left, and thought about all the times she'd felt like she was operating in the margins of military aviation, too unconventional for the mainstream but too valuable to discard. Maybe Vance was right. Maybe instead of fighting to fit into spaces that would always see her as an anomaly, she should operate in spaces built for people who didn't fit standard categories. I accept, she said. Good. Now go get some sleep. You've got 2 weeks to close out here, and knowing you, you'll spend at least half of it helping maintenance rebuild your A-10. The 2 weeks passed in a blur of administrative tasks and unexpected conversations, each one adding layers to Lyra's understanding of how her actions had resonated through the base. She spent mornings in the hangar with Delgado's team, not because she had to, but because watching her aircraft being rebuilt felt important somehow, like honoring a promise between pilot and machine. The A-10 responded to the maintenance attention the way she always did, stubbornly refusing to stay broken, systems coming back online one by one, as if the aircraft itself was determined to prove that the landing had been survivable rather than just survived. Delgado worked with a precision that reminded Lyra of her own approach to flying, every repair methodical and thorough, no shortcuts even when time pressured them. Fly again, Delgado said one afternoon, wiping hydraulic fluid from her hands while they stood beneath the partially reassembled aircraft. Different engines, new landing gear, replacement flight surfaces, but the bones are good, the important parts held. The titanium bathtub, Lyra said, that's what makes her special. Everything else can be replaced. That and the gun. They built this whole plane around the GAU-8, made everything else serve the weapon. Strange way to design an aircraft. Strange but effective. Sometimes the unconventional approach is the right one. Delgado glanced at her, and Lyra saw recognition in the mechanic's eyes. That philosophy worked for you, Captain. So far, ask me again in 20 years. Fair enough. Though if you keep landing aircraft on their bellies, 20 years might be optimistic. Lyra laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. I'm transferring out in a week. Try to keep her flying until then. Already planning on it. This bird's got legend status now. Every mechanic on base wants to say they worked on Raven's A-10. The nickname had stuck harder than Lyra expected, spreading through the base until even people who'd never heard of Sanguin knew the call sign and what it represented. She'd become shorthand for a particular approach to flying, a symbol of competence that didn't ask for permission to prove itself. It was flattering and uncomfortable in equal measure, the weight of representation when all she'd wanted was to do the job well. On her last training flight before transfer, Lyra took up a different A-10, a factory-fresh bird that handled like a dream compared to the worn aircraft she'd grown accustomed to. She flew out over the mountains, running through weapons checks and system verifications, and thought about how different this felt from her usual missions. No ground team calling for support. No enemy fire. No emergencies forcing split-second decisions. Just pure flying, the kind that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. The radio crackled. "Raven 7-3 Tower, how's she handling?" Hendrick's voice, familiar now after the shared experience of that night. "Tower, Raven 7-3, she's smooth, almost boring." "Boring's good sometimes. Not everything needs to be dramatic. Appreciate the wisdom, Tower," circling back for approach. She brought the A-10 around in a wide arc, lining up on the runway with gear down and locked, everything functioning exactly as designed. The landing was textbook perfect, smooth and controlled, the kind they showed in training videos. And somehow it felt less satisfying than the belly landing had, less real, like the difference between rehearsal and performance. When she taxied to parking, she found a small group waiting. Maintenance crews, a few pilots, Tower Chief Hendricks, Fire Chief Ortega. Even Colonel Vance, standing slightly apart but present. Lyra shut down the engines, popped the canopy, and climbed down to scattered applause that felt both genuine and awkward. "Speech," someone called out, and others picked up the call until Lyra held up her hands for silence. "I'm not much for speeches," she said, "but I'll say this. Every pilot in the air is only as good as the people who put them there and keep them flying. The mechanics who maintain these birds. The controllers who talk us through problems, the commanders who trust us to make the right calls. What happened here wasn't just one pilot getting lucky. It was a whole system working the way it's supposed to, everyone doing their job so that when things go wrong, we handle it together." She paused, looking at faces that ranged from curious to supportive to uncertain. "I'm transferring to a new assignment, different missions, different challenges, but I'm taking everything I learned here with me. The professionalism, the support, the understanding that we're all part of something bigger than individual flights. Thank you for that." The applause came again, louder this time, and Lyra accepted it with a simple nod before stepping back. Vance approached, extending her hand. "Safe flights, Captain, make us proud." "I'll make sure the missions succeed, ma'am. Pride's a byproduct." Vance smiled. "That's exactly why you're perfect for where you're going." Qatar hit Lyra like a wall of heat and humidity when she stepped off the transport, the Persian Gulf air thick enough to cut with a knife. The base was smaller than Bagram, more focused, with fewer administrative buildings and more operational hangars. Everything about it suggested an installation built for function rather than comfort, where people came to work missions that didn't make headlines because they weren't supposed to exist. Colonel James Thorne met her personally, a compact man in his 50s with the build of someone who still ran 5 miles every morning, and the eyes of someone who'd seen combat from angles most officers never experienced. He shook her hand with a grip that tested without being aggressive, took her measure in a glance, and nodded like she'd passed some unspoken evaluation. "Cassis, welcome to the 421st Expeditionary Squadron. We don't use the Ghost Squadron nickname officially, but you'll hear it. Don't let it go to your head." "No, sir. Names don't mean much without results to back them up." "Good answer. Walk with me." He led her through the base, past hangars housing A-10s that looked more worn than the aircraft at Bagram, their hulls carrying the kind of scarring that came from repeated exposure to ground fire and hard use. These weren't show birds maintained for inspections. These were workhorses that flew ugly missions and came back damaged often enough that the maintenance crews kept parts inventoried at triple the standard levels. "Our mission profile is straightforward," Thorne said as they walked. We provide close air support for operations that conventional squadrons can't or won't handle. Special operations teams operating in denied territory. Counterterrorism strikes where precision matters more than overwhelming force. Rescue missions where the asset is too valuable to abandon but too complicated for standard extraction. Anything that requires a pilot who can make decisions without waiting for a command chain that might not understand the tactical situation. How much autonomy? Lyra asked. Enough to get you court-martialed if you screw up. Not enough to make you comfortable. You'll fly with mission parameters, but how you execute within those parameters is your call. Ground commanders request support. You provide it however you judge best. You answer to me for results, not methods. They reached an office overlooking the flight line, and Thorne gestured her inside. The walls were covered with maps, photographs of aircraft and personnel, and a single framed quote. Excellence is the gradual result of always striving to do better. Thorne saw her reading it and nodded. Vince Lombardi, football coach, but the principle applies. We don't expect perfection here. We expect continuous improvement and absolute commitment to the mission. Can you provide that? Yes, sir, that's what I've been doing my whole career. I know, I read your file. Sangin, the Bagram landing, the pattern of decisions that work but make command nervous. That pattern stops here, Cassis. Not because we want to change how you fly, but because in this squadron what you do is the baseline expectation. You won't be the outlier, you'll be the standard. Lyra felt something shift in her understanding, a recognition that she'd spent years being exceptional in spaces that didn't quite know what to do with exceptionalism, and now she was entering a space built specifically for people like her. How many pilots in the squadron? 12. All A-10 drivers, all combat veterans, all people who ended up here because conventional squadrons couldn't figure out where they fit. You'll meet them tomorrow at briefing. Tonight, get settled. Rest. Starting tomorrow, you'll earn that Raven call sign properly. I've earned it already, sir. Thorne smiled, the expression sharp. At Bagram, you earned respect from people who didn't understand what you do. Here, you'll earn it from people who do the same work. That's harder, but I think you're ready for it. He extended his hand again, and Lyra shook it, feeling the weight of expectation and opportunity in equal measure. Welcome to the real war, Captain. The one that happens in the margins where policy meets physics and we make the difference. Lyra thought about that phrase as she walked to her quarters, unpacked her gear, and looked out at a flight line full of aircraft that bore the scars of missions she'd only imagined. The real war. Maybe that's what she'd been preparing for all along. The briefing room at 600 hours held 11 pilots who looked like they'd been assembled specifically to challenge every assumption about what military aviators were supposed to be. Lyra entered to find a mix of ages, backgrounds, and attitudes that defied the standard squadron homogeneity. They studied her with the careful assessment of professionals evaluating new competition, and she returned the favor, cataloging details that told stories about how each of them had ended up here. Captain Mike Torres, call sign Hammer, looked like he'd spent his entire career in close air support, his flight suit worn smooth at the elbows, and his eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare that came from too many gun runs in bad situations. Major Rachel Kim, call sign Blade, had the compact build of a gymnast and the focus of someone who'd learned to fly through situations where hesitation meant death. Captain Antonio Ruiz, call sign Ghost, which explained the squadron's nickname, studied her with the intense curiosity of someone trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't been given all the pieces for. The rest of the pilots filled out the spectrum, each one carrying their own story of how conventional military aviation had been too narrow to contain their particular approach to flying. Thorne entered last, and the room fell silent immediately. This is Captain Lyra Cassis, call sign Raven. She's transferring in from Bagram after completing a belly landing that's going to be in training manuals for the next 20 years. Before that, she flew Sangin in 2012, stayed on station with half her aircraft shot away, and convinced the Marines that A-10 pilots are worth their weight in close air support. He paused, letting that settle. She's joining us because conventional squadron operations don't know what to do with pilots who make hard calls correctly. Here, that's Tuesday. Cassis, anything you want to say? Lyra stood, aware of 12 sets of eyes measuring her against standards she was still learning. I fly A-10s because they're built to take punishment and keep fighting. I take missions that require getting low, staying calm, and making things work when the easy answers are gone. I don't need special treatment, don't want exceptions to standards, and I'm here to do the same job everyone in this room does. Support the ground teams, complete the missions, bring the aircraft home, that's all. Torres spoke first, his voice carrying the gravel of too many years breathing dust and jet exhaust. Sanguine, you stayed on station while the ZU-23 was still active. Why? Because the Marines needed cover for extraction. My aircraft was damaged but functional. The tactical equation said stay. And if it had said go, then I would have gone, but it didn't. Kim leaned forward, belly landing at Bagram. You had 10 seconds to decide between ejection and trying to bring her down. What made the call? Training, instinct, understanding that the aircraft could handle it if I flew it right, and knowing that I'd rather own the consequences of my choices than leave them to chance. Ruiz studied her for a long moment before speaking. You know what they say about pilots who make the hard calls look easy? What's that? That they're either geniuses or lucky, and luck always runs out. Which one are you? Lyra met his eyes without hesitation. I'm the pilot who practices emergency procedures until they're instinctive, studies aircraft performance until I know exactly what's possible, and makes decisions based on data instead of hope. Call that whatever you want. I call it being prepared. The room stayed quiet for a beat, and then Torres nodded slowly. All right, I can work with that. Kim smiled. Welcome to the squadron, Raven. Try to keep up. And just like that, the evaluation was over, replaced by the kind of professional acceptance that came from recognizing someone who spoke the same language, who understood the same risks, who'd proven themselves in the same fires. Thorne dismissed the briefing, and as pilots filed out, several stopped to shake Lyra's hand or offer quiet welcomes that carried more weight than formal speeches. She'd entered as an outsider and left as a member, the transition marked by nothing more than mutual recognition of competence. This was where she belonged, finally. 6 months into her assignment with the 421st, Lyra had flown 47 missions ranging from routine to impossible, each one adding layers to her understanding of what it meant to operate in the margins where conventional support ended and specialized capabilities began. She'd provided cover for SEAL team extractions in Syria, conducted precision strikes on high-value targets in Yemen, and spent 14 hours on station during a hostage rescue that required her to hold fire while friendlies and enemies moved within meters of each other. Every mission reinforced the same lesson. Competence wasn't enough. Excellence required understanding when to follow procedures, and when to invent new ones, when to wait for approval, and when to act on tactical judgment alone. The squadron had become something more than a professional assignment. Torres flew her wing on complex missions, his experience complementing her instincts in ways that made them more effective together than separately. Kim taught her techniques for managing fatigue during extended operations, sharing lessons learned from missions that had pushed her past normal human limits. Ruiz challenged her thinking in after-action reviews, forcing her to articulate why she'd made specific choices until the reasoning became clearer than instinct. They were becoming a team, not just in the tactical sense, but in the deeper way that combat forges connections between people who trust each other with their lives. But it was the mission on December 15th that would define her time with the squadron, that would take everything she'd learned and test whether she'd truly earned her place among pilots who made the impossible look routine. The briefing came at 400 hours, Thorne's expression grim as he laid out the situation. Joint Special Operations Team inserted into northern Iraq 72 hours ago to gather intelligence on ISIS command structure. 12 operators. They've been compromised, surrounded in a compound 20 clicks from any friendly position. They're calling for immediate extraction, but the situation's complicated. He pulled up satellite imagery showing a compound in a valley, surrounded by hostile positions and with exactly one road in or out. 200 enemy fighters converging on their position. Heavy weapons including RPGs, technical vehicles with mounted machine guns, and at least 3 armored personnel carriers. Standard extraction isn't viable because the landing zone is too hot for helicopters. The ground force commander is requesting close air support to open an escape corridor so they can move to an alternate LZ where extraction becomes possible. Kim studied the imagery, her expression troubled. That's not close air support. That's air superiority against distributed ground targets in complex terrain. We'd need multiple aircraft, perfect coordination, and probably more ordnance than we can carry. Which is why I'm sending 4 birds, Thorne said. Torres, Kim, Ruiz, and Cassis. You'll work as an integrated team, rotating gun runs to maintain continuous suppression while the ground team moves. This isn't about destroying every enemy position. It's about creating enough chaos and casualties that they can't maintain an organized assault while our people extract. He looked at Lyra specifically. Cassis, you'll run tactical lead. You've got the most recent experience with this kind of close coordination, and the ground commander specifically requested you. Lyra felt the weight of that, the recognition and the responsibility. Based on what, sir? Based on Sangan. Word gets around in special operations circles. They know you don't quit when things get complicated. The mission brief continued for another hour, covering frequencies, coordination protocols, rules of engagement, and contingency plans for everything from aircraft damage to changed enemy positions. By the time they walked to the flight line at 600, Lyra had the entire tactical picture memorized, every detail sharp and clear. The 4 A-10s took off in formation, climbing through pre-dawn darkness toward an objective that would require everything they'd trained for and more. The flight to the objective took 90 minutes, crossing desert terrain that looked peaceful from altitude, but that Lyra knew held dangers invisible to satellite imagery and tactical planning. She ran through communications checks with her wingmen, verified ordnance loads, and mentally rehearsed the coordination that would be required to provide effective support without hitting the friendlies they were trying to save. Torres flew her right wing, his aircraft loaded with a mix of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds that could engage both personnel and vehicles. Kim and Ruiz flew slightly higher and offset, ready to dive in for gun runs while Lyra and Torres pulled up to reassess. It was a rotation they'd practiced dozens of times, each pilot knowing instinctively when to push forward and when to pull back. The ground commander's call came through as they approached the objective area, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone managing a tactical nightmare. Raven 7-3, this is Serpent 6. We are surrounded and taking fire from multiple positions. Enemy is advancing on our compound from 3 directions. We need immediate suppression on marked targets to open a corridor to the north. Lyra switched to her targeting display, acquiring the GPS coordinates Serpent 6 was transmitting. The enemy positions formed a rough semicircle around the compound, heavy weapons dug in with overlapping fields of fire that would shred anyone trying to move in the open. This wasn't going to be a simple gun run. This was going to be surgery with a chainsaw. Serpent 6, Raven 7-3, I have your position and enemy locations. Stand by for immediate engagement. Keep your heads down and mark your position clearly. Roger, Raven, marking with IR strobe. You are cleared hot on all targets outside our compound walls. Lyra rolled inverted and dove, bringing the A-10 down to 800 feet, while Torres mirrored her approach from a slightly different angle. The compound appeared in her targeting reticle, a small rectangular structure with walls that provided minimal protection against the weapons arrayed against it. The IR strobe flashed like a heartbeat, marking where 12 Americans were fighting for their lives. She acquired her first target, a technical vehicle with a heavy machine gun that was pouring fire into the compound's western wall. The GAU-8 cannon spun up with its distinctive sound, and Lyra walked a 2-second burst directly through the vehicle. The technical disintegrated, high-explosive rounds tearing through metal and flesh with precision that turned the threat into wreckage in the space between heartbeats. Torres followed immediately, his gun run targeting a cluster of fighters advancing on the northern approach. His tracers lit up the pre-dawn darkness, each round finding targets with the accuracy that came from years of practice. Enemy positions erupted in smoke and confusion, the sudden violence of close air support creating exactly the chaos they needed. Serpent 6, Raven 7-3, first targets suppressed, moving to engage eastern positions. Roger, Raven, eastern positions are priority. They're trying to flank our northern escape route. Kim and Ruiz dove in as Lyra and Tors pulled up, their gun runs overlapping in a continuous stream of fire that gave the enemy no time to reorganize or respond. The coordination was perfect, each pilot reading the tactical situation and adjusting their approach to maximize coverage while minimizing the risk of friendly fire. For 8 minutes, the 4 A-10s turned the valley into hell, rotating gun runs with mechanical precision while the ground team fought their way toward the northern corridor. And then everything changed. Lyra heard the warning in her headset a half-second before she felt the impact, Tor's voice sharp with alarm. "Raven, you've got AAA at your 6. Break right." The 23 rounds caught her portside, punching through armor in a pattern that sent every warning system in the cockpit into screaming urgency. The A-10 shuddered like it had been hit with a sledgehammer, hydraulic pressure, dropping instantly, while Lyra's muscle memory took over before her conscious mind could process what was happening. She rolled hard right, pushed the throttles forward, and climbed away from the gun position that had caught her in a moment of vulnerability. Behind her, Tors was already engaging the anti-aircraft position with a fury that said he'd taken the attack on his flight lead personally. The 23 gun went silent permanently, reduced to scrap metal by a sustained burst that obliterated the position and everyone manning it. But the damage was done. Lyra's port engine was dying, temperature spiking while oil pressure dropped toward zero. The starboard engine was running rough but functional. Flight control hydraulics were compromised but not gone. She had power, she had control, and she had a ground team that still needed her. "Raven 7-3 declaring emergency," she transmitted, her voice calm despite the alarms screaming around her. "Port engine failure, hydraulics degraded, continuing mission." "Raven Tower," Thorne's voice cut through from Qatar, urgent. "Status report." "Tower Raven, I'm flyable, continuing support mission." "Negative Raven, RTB immediately, will vector additional support." "Sir, with respect, the ground team needs continuous coverage for another 15 minutes to reach extraction." "I'm the tactical lead. I'm staying." The silence on the radio lasted 3 seconds, and Lyra knew Thorne was making calculations about risk versus mission necessity, weighing her safety against the lives of 12 operators who'd called for help. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that had no good options. "Raven, approved to continue. You break off at first sign of structural failure." "Understood." "Understood. Raven continuing mission." Tors pulled alongside, his aircraft close enough that she could see his face through the canopy, his expression concerned but trusting. "You good, Raven?" "I'm good, Hammer. Let's finish this." They dove back into the rotation, Lyra compensating for her damaged aircraft's handling with adjustments so instinctive they didn't require conscious thought. The port engine was dead weight now, shut down completely to prevent fire. The starboard engine was carrying the entire load, running at parameters that would destroy it over time, but that could sustain flight for the critical minutes they needed. She made her gun runs more carefully now, managing energy and altitude with precision that left no margin for error. Every maneuver was calculated to keep her in parameters where the damaged aircraft could still respond, still fight, still provide the support that meant the difference between extraction and massacre. Kim and Ruiz increased their tempo, taking more of the targeting load while Tors flew close enough to intervene if Lyra's aircraft failed catastrophically. The coordination was flawless, years of training and months of flying together creating a synchronization that turned 4 damaged and determined pilots into a weapon system greater than the sum of its parts. Serpent 6's voice came through, tense but moving. "Raven, Serpent 6, we're at the extraction corridor. Enemy pressure is decreasing. We're going to make it because of you. Serpent 6, Raven, get your people home. We'll maintain coverage until you're clear." For another 12 minutes, Lyra flew her crippled, with one engine, degraded hydraulics, and warning lights that had stopped meaning anything except that she was still airborne and still fighting. She made 3 more gun runs, each one precise and controlled, her damaged aircraft responding like it understood what was at stake. Finally, the call she'd been waiting for. Raven, Serpent 6. All personnel aboard extraction birds. We are clear. Thank you doesn't begin to cover this. Serpent 6, Raven, just doing the job. Glad you made it. Only then did she let herself acknowledge the full extent of her aircraft's damage, the way systems were failing in cascade patterns, the way the starboard engine was developing a vibration that spoke of imminent catastrophic failure. She turned toward Qatar, climbing slowly to altitude that would give her options if the remaining engine quit. Tors flew her wing the entire way home, silent guardian watching for